Hello, everyone, and welcome back. In our earlier lectures, we explored indigenous civilizations before sustained European contact, and we examined several of the major explanations historians give for European conquest in the Americas. This final section, we're going to examine one particularly controversial interpretation that asks whether violence and conflict within indigenous societies prior to European arrival may have created opportunities later exploited during conquest. As we move through this lecture, remember the broader historical question we've been building toward. How and why did Native Americans succumb to European conquest? Or, phrased another way, how and why were England, Spain, and other European powers eventually able to conquer and settle large portions of the Americas? You may choose to answer that question independently in your writing, or you may choose to incorporate some of the evidence and interpretations we discuss here. You may choose to answer that question independently in your writing, or you may choose to incorporate some of the evidence and interpretations we discuss here. For this final portion, we are examining an article by archaeologist Timothy Kohler titled Better Angels of Their Nature, which explores violence in pre-European Mesa Verde societies. Kohler is an archaeologist and professor at Washington State University, and before we examine his argument directly, we need to understand the historiographical background surrounding this topic. Prior to roughly the 1930s, the history of European conquest in the Americas was often written from a highly Eurocentric perspective, or from the perspective of the conquerors and colonizers themselves. These histories tended to emphasize European superiority, military success, and the supposed inevitability of conquest. Historians often focused on explaining how relatively small groups of Europeans were able to conquer much larger indigenous civilizations. Beginning around the 1930s, the historiography began to shift. You'll remember from our earlier discussions that historiography refers to the history of historical writing itself, or the evolving body of scholarship surrounding a topic. During the Great Depression, many intellectuals and academics became increasingly interested in theories connected to class conflict, economic inequality, and systems of power. Some scholars became deeply influenced by Marxist interpretations of history, which emphasized struggles between powerful and powerless groups, colonizers and colonized peoples, elites and workers. As these approaches became more influential, historians increasingly emphasized conquest, exploitation, inequality, and systems of domination within colonial history. Over time, scholarship surrounding Native American history also evolved. European conquest was increasingly interpreted through lenses focused on power, resistance, colonization, race, class, and inequality. Especially beginning in the 1960s, universities became more diverse, and scholars from historically marginalized communities increasingly began writing the histories of their own peoples and cultures. As a result, many historians worked intentionally to restore dignity, agency, and complexity to indigenous histories that had often been ignored or differently interpreted in earlier scholarship. However, by the late 20th century, some scholars also began arguing that certain historical questions had become comparatively understudied, particularly questions involving violence within indigenous societies prior to European arrival. Topics such as warfare, cannibalism, political executions, or internal conflict were often viewed as highly sensitive, because historians worried such discussions could potentially be used to justify conquest or reinforce harmful stereotypes. This is the context into which Timothy Kohler enters. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, some historians and archaeologists argued that scholarship had become too cautious about examining certain forms of violence in pre-contact societies. Kohler's response was essentially, we need to examine the evidence directly. His goal was not simply to sensationalize violence, but to ask what kinds of violence existed prior to European arrival. How widespread was that violence? Was it constant or episodic? Did it occur mostly between groups or within groups as well? In other words, Kohler wanted to quantify the degree and intensity of conflict in pre-European Mesa Verde societies. Now, let's look briefly at his approach. Kohler examined societies primarily between roughly 1100 and 1400 AD, meaning more than a century before sustained Spanish arrival in the region. Geographically, he focuses on areas associated with Mesa Verde, particularly regions within present-day Colorado and New Mexico. Why this region? Because it was one of the most densely populated agricultural areas in North America at the time. Kohler wanted to examine a society where large populations existed, because population density could potentially help explain patterns of violence. He also wanted to test a long-standing scholarly hypothesis, the idea that agricultural societies tend to be less violent than hunter-gatherer societies. So this is important. Kohler intentionally chose an agricultural civilization in order to test whether that assumption actually held true. Let's pause for a moment and think about historical reasoning. Notice what Kohler is doing as both a historian and archaeologist. He is not relying on one artifact, or one skeleton, or one source. Instead, he is combining multiple forms of evidence: skeletal remains, architecture, environmental conditions, settlement patterns, population shifts, and visual iconography in order to build a broader interpretation. That is an important part of historical methodology. Good historians rarely build conclusions from a single isolated piece of evidence. Instead, they compare evidence across multiple categories to see whether patterns begin to emerge. How exactly did Kohler and his team study violence? First, they used osteology, the study of bones. Specifically, they searched for evidence of violent trauma, spear wounds, skull fractures, crushing injuries, embedded projectile points, and other signs of lethal conflict. Second, they examined architecture. Defensive structures can tell archaeologists a great deal about relationships between neighboring communities. For example, if two nearby villages both build heavy fortifications against one another, that may suggest hostility or fear. If multiple communities instead share broader defensive systems, that may suggest alliances or cooperation. Third, Kohler's team examined rock art and iconography, comparing artistic depictions of violence with the physical injuries found in skeletal remains. Again, this matters because archaeologists generally try not to rely on only one type of evidence. Now, what did Kohler conclude? First, he argued that native populations in the region experienced significant decline prior to European arrival. Second, he argued that resource scarcity, especially scarcity involving food and water, intensified violence. In many ways, his argument reflects broader theories about competition and survival. Kohler concluded that intergroup violence existed, and both personal and organized violence appear throughout the archaeological record. In other words, violence occurred within villages, between rival communities, and sometimes on extremely large scales. Kohler also found evidence suggesting episodic raiding, including raids for food, water, and women. Here's where the argument becomes especially controversial. Kohler and his team also argued that some evidence suggests cannibalism occurred within the region. This became highly debated because many 20th century scholars considered claims about indigenous cannibalism politically dangerous or historically exploitative. Now, here's where the methodology becomes especially interesting. Kohler's team did not simply claim cannibalism based on rumor or assumption. Instead, they examined pottery residues using chemical analysis. Researchers discovered certain fatty compounds and enzymes that are associated with the boiling of human tissue and bone. In other words, when human remains are cooked repeatedly, they leave behind chemical signatures somewhat different from those associated with animal remains. Kohler's team combined this residue analysis with cut marks on bones, breakage patterns, burning evidence, and other archaeological findings to argue that at least some forms of cannibalistic behavior likely occurred. But again, historians and archaeologists still debate interpretation. Does this evidence suggest ritual behavior, warfare practices, survival cannibalism during famine, funerary customs, or something else entirely? This is an important reminder that evidence alone does not automatically produce certainty. Historians must still interpret evidence carefully, compare competing explanations, and remain aware of the limitations of the historical record. However, Kohler's team argued that certain pottery residues contained fatty compounds associated with boiling human tissue or bone. Combined with skeletal evidence and other archaeological findings, they concluded that at least some forms of cannibalistic behavior likely occurred. But this is where historians must think carefully. Even if evidence suggests cannibalism existed, historians still need to ask important interpretive questions. Was it regular, ritualistic, survival-based, symbolic, associated with warfare, or connected to funerary practices? For example, was something more similar to the Donner Party during starvation conditions? Or was it part of broader cultural practices? This distinction matters. Historical evidence often tells us that something happened, but interpretation involves trying to understand why, how, under what circumstances, and how frequently. Kohler also identified what he calls extreme processing. Essentially, group executions used to induce political compliance or reinforce authority. For example, if a political leader publicly executed a group of rivals, that violence could discourage resistance from others. Kohler additionally concluded that water scarcity often intensified defensive behavior. Communities located near reliable water sources frequently built stronger defensive systems, suggesting that access to resources increased conflict. At the same time, evidence also suggested that neighboring communities sometimes cooperated closely, even when they possessed distinct cultural identities. Kohler also distinguishes between state violence and non-state violence. State violence refers to organized violence imposed by political authorities. Non-state violence includes interpersonal conflict, raiding, robbery, and murder, or localized warfare. Again, Kohler's larger argument is not simply about indigenous people specifically. He believes these patterns reflect broader human tendencies, especially under conditions of scarcity, environmental stress, political instability, and competition over resources. Finally, Kohler argues that these pre-existing rivalries and conflicts may have created opportunities later exploited by European conquerors. For example, if one indigenous group had long-standing hostilities with another group, Spanish forces could potentially ally with one side against the other. And if you've read some of the Nahua accounts of conquest, you'll remember that some indigenous groups did in fact use Spanish alliances strategically against rival powers. So one of Kohler's major conclusions is that these historical rivalries, combined with resource conflict and political fragmentation, helped create conditions Europeans later exploited during conquest. Ultimately, Kohler's work reminds us that history is rarely simple. Human societies are capable of cooperation, innovation, adaptation, violence, alliance building, and conflict, often simultaneously. And part of thinking historically means being willing to examine evidence carefully, even when the conclusions are uncomfortable, debated, or politically sensitive. As always, I encourage you to read the article yourself. Think critically about the evidence and consider both the strengths and possible limitations of Kohler's interpretations. All right, everyone. I hope this helps clarify Kohler's argument, and I'll see you in the next lecture.